HMS Hood did not die slowly. She vanished. One moment, the pride of the Royal Navy was cutting through the gray water of the Denmark Strait, her long hull driving forward through spray and smoke, her guns answering the German battleship on the horizon. The next moment, a shell from Bismarck found the place every sailor feared, and a towering sheet of fire rose where Britain's most famous warship had been. The blast tore through the ship so quickly that men on nearby vessels could hardly understand what they were seeing. Hood, the symbol of imperial sea power, the ship's schoolboys knew by name, was gone in minutes. More than 1,400 men went with her. Only 3 survived. Across the water, Bismarck was still moving. Her guns were still ready. Her flag was still flying. She had taken damage, but she was alive, and now the Atlantic seemed to open in front of her like a hunting ground. But after Hood, Bismarck was no longer just a German raider trying to reach the shipping lanes. She had become something far more dangerous to Britain, a wound that the Empire had to close. The order was simple in spirit, even when it was complicated on the map. Find Bismarck, stop Bismarck, sink Bismarck. From that moment, this was no longer just a naval operation. It was revenge. Welcome to Steel Tides. Today, we are telling the story of Bismarck, the ship the entire empire hunted. A battleship built to break into the Atlantic and threaten Britain's lifeline. A ship that destroyed HMS Hood in one of the most shocking moments of the war at sea, and a ship that was then chased across the ocean by cruisers, battleships, destroyers, aircraft carriers, flying boats, radio stations, codebreakers, and every available piece of British naval power that could be thrown into the hunt. Before we go deeper, subscribe to Steel Tides if you want more stories about battleships, convoys, sea warfare, and the decisions that changed history far from land. And write in the comments right now, after Bismarck sank Hood, do you think she still had a real chance to escape, or was she doomed from that moment? I want to see your answer before the chase begins. To understand why Britain reacted so fiercely, you have to understand what Bismarck represented. She was not just another warship. She was one of the most powerful battleships in the world, armed with 8 15-inch guns, protected by heavy armor, and fast enough to choose many of her fights. For Nazi Germany, she was a weapon built for the Atlantic, not to fight a formal duel for honor, not to sit in a harbor as a symbol, but to break into Britain's sea lanes and tear at the merchant shipping that kept the island alive. Britain was an island empire. Its armies, factories, fuel supplies, food stocks, and future operations all depended on ships. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a side campaign, it was the struggle that decided whether Britain could continue fighting at all. U-boats were already attacking convoys, sinking merchantmen, forcing the Royal Navy to stretch itself across enormous distances. If a battleship like Bismarck broke into those convoy routes, the threat would not be measured only in ships sunk. It would be measured in panic, rerouted convoys, tied down escorts, delayed cargo, and the knowledge that one German capital ship could appear where she was least expected. A battleship did not need to sink every ship to change the war. She only had to make every convoy fear that she might be over the horizon. Bismarck's first operation was called Rheinübung. She would sail with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, break out from northern waters into the Atlantic, and attack Allied shipping. The plan was bold, dangerous, and exactly the kind of operation Germany needed if it wanted to hurt Britain without matching the Royal Navy ship for ship. Germany could not win a traditional surface war against the whole British fleet, but it could send powerful raiders into the ocean and force Britain to scatter its strength in response. Bismarck and Prinz Eugen left the Baltic in May 1941. They moved toward Norway, then prepared to push out into the Atlantic through the northern route. But From the beginning, secrecy was imperfect. The German ships were seen. Reports reached the British. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed them in Norwegian waters. The Admiralty understood that something serious was happening. A German battleship was not at sea by accident. The Royal Navy began to move. HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales were sent to intercept. Hood was famous, but she was old in ways that mattered. She was a battle cruiser built for speed and heavy guns, but not protected like a modern battleship against every kind of long-range plunging fire. Prince of Wales was new, so new that some of her systems were still not fully reliable, and civilian technicians were aboard to help with gun problems. Yet together, they represented Britain's immediate answer to the breakout. On paper, it was a confrontation between great ships. In reality, it was a meeting of different kinds of danger. Hood carried prestige and experience, but also vulnerability. Prince of Wales carried modern armor and guns, but also mechanical uncertainty. Bismarck carried speed, firepower, confidence, and the advantage of being the new weapon Britain could not allow to roam free. In the early hours of May 24th, British cruisers had already found and shadowed the Germans in the Denmark Strait, the cold passage between Greenland and Iceland. HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk kept contact in mist and poor visibility, feeding the hunters with position reports. Hood and Prince of Wales closed in. The sea was gray, the light was strange, and the ships were moving toward a fight that would last only minutes but echo through the entire war. Admiral Lancelot Holland, commanding from Hood, chose to attack quickly. He needed to close the range. Hood's vulnerability to long-range fire was a real concern, and the faster he brought his ships into a position where their own fire could be decisive, the better. But closing the range meant sailing into the German guns while the geometry of the battle was still unfolding. There was confusion over which German ship was Bismarck and which was Prince Eugen. There were course changes, there were salvos falling short and then walking closer. Then Bismarck found the exact details of Hood's destruction have been studied for decades, but the effect was immediate and terrible. A shell penetrated, fire reached the wrong place, and the ship's magazines detonated. Hood broke apart with such speed that nearby sailors saw a warship become flame and smoke before their minds could accept it. In the space of a few minutes, Britain had lost one of the most famous ships in the world and nearly her entire crew. For the men aboard Prince of Wales, there was no time to grieve. They were still under fire. Their guns were suffering mechanical failures, but they hit Bismarck. One hit caused flooding. Another damaged fuel lines and reduced Bismarck's operational freedom. These were not dramatic hits in the way Hood's destruction had been dramatic, but they mattered. Bismarck could no longer continue her mission as planned. She was leaking oil, losing fuel, and facing the reality that the Atlantic raid might already be over before it had truly begun. Prince of Wales, damaged and outmatched in the moment, disengaged. The Battle of the Denmark Strait had lasted roughly a quarter of an hour. In that time, Bismarck had achieved a stunning tactical victory and created a strategic crisis. Hood was gone, Prince of Wales had been driven off, the German ship was damaged, but still alive, still fast, and still dangerous. If Bismarck vanished into the Atlantic, she could threaten convoys, force major diversions, and give Germany a propaganda triumph at exactly the moment Britain needed to show that it still ruled the sea. The Admiralty did not merely want Bismarck followed, It wanted her destroyed. After Hood, this was no longer a hunt for a raider. It was revenge. Across the Atlantic, orders moved faster than ships. Warships were pulled from convoy duty. Battleships turned toward the chase. Cruisers maintained contact where they could. Aircraft carriers became essential because no battleship could be everywhere, and the Atlantic was too large for guns alone. The home fleet under Admiral John Tovey moved with HMS King George V. The old battleship Rodney, which had been heading elsewhere, was redirected into the hunt. HMS Victorious was involved. Far to the south, Force H, including HMS Ark Royal, would become crucial. The Empire began to close its hand. But Bismarck was not helpless. She was damaged, not defeated. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, commanding the German force, had to decide what to do next. Continuing the Atlantic raiding mission was no longer realistic. The damage from Prince of Wales had reduced fuel and created a visible oil trail. Bismarck needed repair, and returning through the northern route would mean forcing her way back through British strength. So the decision was made to head toward occupied France, where German-controlled ports such as Brest or Saint-Nazaire offered the possibility of repair under friendly air cover. If Bismarck could reach France, she might live to fight again. That was the nightmare for Britain. Hood would still be gone, and Bismarck would be in a French Atlantic port, repaired, protected, and potentially available for future operations. The psychological result would be brutal. Britain would have lost its icon, failed to avenge it, and still have the enemy battleship sitting like a threat across the Channel approaches and Atlantic routes. So the chase became a race. Bismarck needed distance. Britain needed contact. Every hour mattered. Every course change mattered. Fuel mattered. Weather mattered. Radio silence mattered. A ship the size of a battleship seems impossible to hide, but the ocean is not a harbor. In the North Atlantic, fog, weather, distance, and uncertainty can swallow even a giant. A battleship can disappear if the shadowing cruisers lose her for long enough. The British tried to slow her first with air attack. Late on May 24th, Swordfish torpedo aircraft from HMS Victorious attacked Bismarck in harsh conditions. The ferry Swordfish looked outdated even then, a fabric-covered biplane from an earlier age, slow and ungainly compared with the sleek modern machines people imagine when they think of air power. But the Swordfish had one quality that mattered more than beauty. It could fly from carriers in bad weather and deliver a torpedo against a ship at sea. The attack from Victorious scored a hit, but it did not cripple Bismarck. The torpedo caused limited damage, though the violent maneuvers required to avoid the attack worsened the strain on earlier damage and forced temporary speed reductions. Bismarck kept moving. The hunters were still behind. The French coast was still the goal. Then, in the early hours of May 25th, Bismarck slipped away. The British shadowing force lost contact. The ocean swallowed her. For a time, one of the most wanted ships in the world was loose, and no one on the British side could say with confidence exactly where she was. This was one of the most dangerous moments of the chase. The Royal Navy had thrown enormous effort into finding and destroying Bismarck, but if she reached the air umbrella of occupied France, the chase might fail. Inside British command, the pressure must have been extraordinary. Hood had been destroyed. The public would soon know. The Navy was hunting, but the target had disappeared. Ships were burning fuel at a desperate rate. Some could not continue forever. The Atlantic was too large, the information too imperfect, and the consequences too high. Then Bismarck helped reveal herself. Admiral Lütjens believed he was still being shadowed and sent a long radio message to German headquarters. British stations intercepted the transmission, and direction finding helped establish a bearing. But even this did not immediately solve the problem. Plotting errors and uncertainty caused confusion, and for a time British forces moved in the wrong direction. Bismarck gained precious distance. This is the part of the story where the legend of Bismarck as an unstoppable giant becomes misleading. She was not invincible. She was not free. She was damaged, hunted, low on options, and dependent on reaching France before the British could bring enough power to bear. Her strength was real, but so was her isolation. A battleship alone in the Atlantic is powerful only as long as she can move, steer, and choose distance. Once those advantages are gone, armor becomes a coffin made of steel. By May 26th, the situation was becoming desperate for the British. Many ships were short of fuel. Time was running out. Bismarck seemed close to escaping. Then, in the morning, a Royal Air Force Catalina flying boat spotted her. The sighting changed everything. The target was found again, but still not stopped. Finding Bismarck was only the first step. Britain needed to slow her before she reached German air cover. That task fell to Ark Royal. HMS Ark Royal was an aircraft carrier, and her Swordfish would become the unlikely executioners of one of the most feared battleships afloat. There is something almost absurd about it. A modern armored battleship built with huge guns and heavy protection, running for safety, and the weapon that doomed her was not another battleship's shell, but a slow biplane flying through rough weather with a torpedo slung beneath it. The first strike from Ark Royal nearly became a disaster of a different kind. The Swordfish crews attacked a large ship they believed to be Bismarck, but it was HMS Sheffield, a British cruiser shadowing the German battleship. Sheffield's captain handled the danger with remarkable nerve, and the faulty torpedo detonators helped prevent catastrophe. The aircraft returned. The mistake was corrected. The torpedoes were changed to more reliable contact fuses. There would be one more chance. In the evening of May 26th, Ark Royal launched the second strike. The weather was awful. The flight deck was moving in heavy seas. The wind was hard. The light was fading. The pilots were flying aircraft that looked too slow for the task toward a battleship that could fill the air around them with anti-aircraft fire. But the Swordfish had to go, because no other weapon was in position to do what had to be done. They found Bismarck and attacked from different directions, forcing the German ship to maneuver. Bismarck fired with everything she could bring to bear. The sea threw spray into the air. The aircraft came in low. Torpedoes entered the water and ran toward the hull. One hit changed the entire chase. A torpedo struck near the stern and jammed Bismarck's rudders. The damage trapped her in a turn, leaving her unable to steer properly toward France. The crew tried desperately to fix the steering. Divers and repair parties struggled with the damage. Engineering skill, courage, and discipline were thrown at the problem, but the rudders would not come free. The ship could still move, but she could not truly choose where she was going. That was the death sentence. Not a magazine explosion, not a single shell through the heart, not a clean duel between battleships. Bismarck was doomed by steering gear, by metal twisted in exactly the wrong place, by one torpedo from aircraft many had considered obsolete. The great battleship could still she could still resist, but she could not escape. After Hood, this had been revenge. After the torpedo, it became execution by geography. The ocean that had hidden Bismarck now held her in place. Admiral Lutyens signaled that the ship was no longer maneuverable and would fight to the last shell. Whatever one thinks of the cause for which Bismarck sailed, there is no denying the reality faced by the men aboard her that night. They knew the British battleships were coming. They knew the French coast was beyond reach. They knew their ship, which had seemed so powerful only days earlier, was now turning helplessly in heavy seas, waiting for dawn. The night before the final battle was not quiet. British destroyers harassed Bismarck through darkness and bad weather, attacking, shadowing, forcing the crew to remain at action stations, wearing down men who already knew the end was approaching. Among the ships involved was the Polish destroyer Piorun, whose crew signaled defiance and engaged the German battleship with a courage that became part of the legend of the chase. These destroyer attacks did not sink Bismarck, but they denied her peace. They kept pressure on the wounded giant through the final hours. Imagine being aboard Bismarck during that night. The ship still massive beneath your feet, still armed, still armored, but no longer free. The engines could turn, the guns could train, the crew could work, but the horizon was no longer a choice. Somewhere beyond the dark, British battleships were closing. The men had seen what their own guns had done to Hood. They knew what heavy shells could do. They also knew that when morning came, there would be no running battle, no clean escape, no sudden rescue from the air. There would be a final stand in the open Atlantic. Right in the comments was, Bismarck truly defeated by the Royal Navy's overwhelming power, or by one lucky torpedo from a slow aircraft, because this is where the story becomes more than a chase. It becomes a question about the end of the battleship age. The biggest guns in the world meant nothing if a ship could no longer steer. At dawn on May 27th, the hunters arrived. HMS King George V and HMS Rodney closed in. Rodney was old, powerful, and had pushed hard to reach the fight. Her engines had been driven brutally during the chase, and now she brought 9 16-inch guns to bear. King George V added her own heavy fire. Cruisers and other ships were nearby. Bismarck, crippled but not silent, prepared to fight. The first British salvos came in through the gray morning. Bismarck answered as best she could. For a short time she remained dangerous, and British ships treated her with the caution due to a battleship whose guns could still kill. But a ship unable to maneuver is a target being slowly solved by enemy fire. British shells began to hit. Fire control was damaged. Turrets were knocked out. Communications broke down. The battle became less a duel and more a dismantling. Rodney and King George V closed the range and continued firing. The sea around Bismarck erupted. Her superstructure was smashed. Her guns fell silent one by one. The ship that had destroyed Hood now absorbed the concentrated punishment of the empire she had enraged. This is where the story must be told with restraint. It is easy to turn the final battle into spectacle, to describe only flame and wreckage, but inside that steel hull were men. Many were young. Many had no control over the decisions that had sent them into the Atlantic. They served a brutal regime, and their ship had killed British sailors days earlier. But in the final hours, they were also human beings, trapped aboard a dying vessel. Naval war often turns ships into symbols, but ships are crewed by people, and the sea is merciless to all flags. By the end, Bismarck was a wreck. British battleships were running low on fuel and ammunition, and the cruiser Dorsetshire was ordered in to finish the job with torpedoes. At the same time, German survivors later said scuttling charges had been set inside the ship. For decades, the exact balance between British damage and German scuttling has been debated, but the practical truth is simple. Bismarck was finished. She capsized and sank beneath the Atlantic on the morning of May 27, 1941. The hunt was over. Only a little more than 100 men from Bismarck were rescued by British ships before a U-boat alarm forced the rescuers away. A few more were picked up later by German vessels. More than 2,000 members of her crew were lost. On the British side, the loss of Hood remained the emotional center of the operation because more than 1,400 men had died in the opening blow. Nearly 4,000 British and German sailors had been lost in 1 week of pursuit, battle, and cold Atlantic water. When the sea closed over Bismarck, Britain had won more than a tactical victory. It had answered the destruction of Hood. It had prevented a dangerous raider from reaching the Atlantic convoy routes. It had denied Germany the propaganda triumph of sending Bismarck safely into France after sinking Britain's most famous warship, and it had shown something important about modern naval war. The battleship was still terrifying, but it no longer ruled the sea alone. Aircraft had decided the chase, not by sinking Bismarck outright, but by taking away her movement. The Swordfish from Ark Royal did what the entire pursuing fleet needed done. They slowed the target. They turned the chase from uncertain to inevitable. After that, the big guns could finish the battle. This is the lesson hidden inside the drama. Bismarck was built as a capital ship for a world where armor, speed, and heavy guns defined sea power. But she was stopped by carrier aircraft, tracked by reconnaissance, found through intelligence, harassed by destroyers, and destroyed by a fleet working as a system. No single weapon won the hunt alone. The Empire hunted with everything's signals: aircraft, cruisers, battleships, destroyers, fuel, persistence, and rage. And rage mattered. The Royal Navy had lost ships before. It would lose ships again. But Hood was different. Hood was not merely a warship in the British imagination. She was the visible symbol of naval pride between the wars. Her destruction was a public wound before it was even fully public. Men in the Admiralty understood what had happened. A German battleship had blown apart the ship that represented British sea power, and if that same German battleship escaped, the damage would not be only military, it would be psychological. That is why the chase feels so relentless. It was strategic necessity, yes. Bismarck could not be allowed to raid shipping, but it was also emotional necessity. The Empire needed proof that Hood had been avenged, that the Royal Navy could still reach out across the ocean and destroy the enemy that had humiliated it. After Hood, this was no longer a hunt for a raider. It was revenge. Yet revenge alone does not explain the scale of the operation. The British did not chase Bismarck only because they were angry. They chased her because the convoy war demanded it. A single German battleship in the Atlantic could force convoys to scatter, delay, reroute, or wait for heavier escort. She could draw British ships away from other duties. She could create fear in the merchant service and force the Royal Navy to defend everywhere at once. Even if Bismarck never sank another major warship, she could distort the entire Atlantic War simply by existing at sea. That is the power of a raider. A raider is not trying to conquer the ocean. A raider is trying to make the ocean unsafe, to make the enemy spend more strength than the raider costs, to create uncertainty across shipping lanes that are too long to guard perfectly. Bismarck's mission was dangerous because Britain's survival depended on keeping those lanes open. Every convoy mattered, every tanker mattered, every freighter mattered. The German surface fleet did not need to defeat the Royal Navy in a Trafalgar-style battle. It only needed to make the lifeline bleed. This is also why Bismarck's loss mattered so deeply to Germany. She had been a huge investment of steel, labor, prestige, and hope. Her first operation became her last. The Kriegsmarine would continue to threaten Britain, especially through U-boats, but the dream of surface raiders breaking the Atlantic in decisive fashion became harder to sustain. Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship, would spend much of her career as a threat in being, tying down Allied forces, frightening convoy planners, and drawing repeated attacks, but the fate of Bismarck hung over every decision. The hunt also revealed the fragility of even the strongest ships. Bismarck survived heavy punishment at first. Her armor worked in many places. Her guns were deadly. Her crew was capable. But a battleship is a machine of systems. Fuel, steering, fire control, communications, radar, engines, pumps, ammunition handling, damage control, all of it must work under shock, water, smoke, noise, and fear. Break the right system at the right moment, and the size of the ship becomes almost irrelevant. The torpedo did not need to destroy Bismarck. It only needed to make her predictable. Once she could not steer, the Atlantic was no longer a road to France. It was a cage. There is a strange sadness in that image, even for an enemy ship, a battleship built to cross oceans, reduced to circling in heavy seas, a vessel designed for speed and power, waiting for slower but relentless enemies to arrive, a crew that had celebrated the destruction of Hood, now facing the same oceanic helplessness that they had helped create for others. War has a way of reversing roles quickly. One morning, you are the hunter. 2 mornings later, every horizon belongs to someone hunting you. By the time Bismarck sank, the legend was already forming. Britain had its revenge, Germany had its martyrship. Naval historians had a case study that would be argued over for generations. Was Lütjens too cautious? Should Bismarck have returned to Norway after being damaged? Should Prince Eugen have stayed or separated? Did the British get lucky, or did they create enough chances that luck finally had somewhere to land? Was Bismarck sunk by gunfire, torpedoes, scuttling, or all of them together? But for steel tides, the deeper question is this: what did it take to kill one ship? It took cruisers shadowing through the Denmark Strait. It took Prince of Wales damaging her fuel and forcing a change of plan. It took aircraft from Victorious and Ark Royal. It took a Catalina flying boat finding her when time was almost gone. It took destroyers harassing her through the night. It took Rodney and King George V closing in at dawn. It took Dorsetshire torpedoes. It took radio interception, direction finding, endurance, fuel, and command decisions made under pressure. It took the attention of an empire. That is why Bismarck remains famous. Not because she won a campaign, because she did not because she transformed the Atlantic War by herself, because her operational career lasted only days. She remains famous because she compressed the entire drama of sea power into one chase: pride, shock, intelligence, pursuit, mechanical failure, air power, battleship fire, and the final silence of a ship going under. And she remains famous because of Hood. Without Hood, Bismarck might still have been hunted, but the story would not burn the same way. Hood made the chase personal. Hood turned a strategic threat into a national demand. Hood gave the British public and the Royal Navy a single sentence that needed an ending: Bismarck must be sunk. Near the end of this story, write in the comments again, do you think the British victory was mainly skill, mainly luck, or mainly overwhelming force? Because the honest answer may be that it was all three. Skill found and shadowed Bismarck. Luck placed one torpedo where it mattered most. Overwhelming force made sure that once she was crippled, she would not survive the morning. The ocean rarely gives clean answers. It gives wrecks, survivors, signals, and arguments. Bismarck's wreck now lies deep in the Atlantic, far from the cold morning when Hood disappeared, and far from the final gunfire of May 27th. The steel is silent, the flags are gone. The men who hunted her and the men who served aboard her have mostly passed into history. But the story remains because it captures something timeless about naval warfare. A ship can be powerful enough to terrify an empire and still be one mechanical failure away from death. Bismarck entered the Atlantic as a predator. She sank the pride of the Royal Navy and shook Britain's confidence in a single morning. But that victory also sealed her fate, because from the moment Hood exploded, Bismarck was no longer simply trying to complete a mission. She was trying to outrun the anger of an empire built on sea power. She almost made it. That is what makes the story so tense. She was not doomed from the first mile. She had speed, she had armor, she had skilled officers, and a disciplined crew. She had a path to France. She had hours where the British had lost her. She had moments where history might have turned a few degrees in her favor. But then a flying boat found her. A carrier launched its old biplanes into awful weather, and one torpedo struck the one place that mattered more than all the armor in the world. After that, the hunt was no longer a question of whether Britain could find Bismarck. It was a question of how long she could endure before the horizon filled with guns. The ship the entire empire hunted did not fall because one thing went wrong. She fell because a chain closed around her link by link, a damaged fuel system, a visible oil trail, a radio message, a sighting from the air, a carrier strike, a jammed rudder, a night of harassment, and a dawn of battleship fire. Each piece alone might not have been enough. Together they made escape impossible. That is the real shape of the Bismarck story. Not invincibility, not simple revenge, not one lucky hit in isolation. It is the story of how a modern naval system killed a powerful ship that had become too dangerous to leave alive. Hood vanished in flame and smoke. Bismarck died under the weight of an empire's answer. Between those two moments, the Atlantic became a hunting ground, and every ship, aircraft, signal station, and commander involved became part of the chase. Subscribe to Steel Tides and turn on notifications if you want more stories like this. The ships that terrified nations, the convoys that kept armies alive, and the naval decisions that changed the course of the war. And leave your final verdict in the comments. Did Bismarck ever truly have a chance after Hood, or did sinking Britain's most famous warship guarantee that the entire empire would hunt her until she was gone? Because in May of 1941, one German battleship fired the shots that made her legendary, and in doing so, she made herself impossible to spare.